It's a beautiful Friday morning here in Lagos. Good morning, everyone. 5 more days to Christmas. Thank you for joining us. We continue our conversation on the 2025 budget presented by President Bola Tinubu to the National Assembly. The 49.7 trillion naira budget is tagged Budget of Restoration, Securing Peace, and Rebuilding Prosperity. And it promises to drive economic growth, create opportunities, and invest in Nigeria's youthful population. Reactions continue to trail Mr. President's proposed spending plan. Some stakeholders have praised government's commitment to infrastructure development, education, and healthcare, but others have also now raised concerns about the budget's ambitious revenue projections and the potential risks of debt servicing. My guest yesterday even said it will take magic to achieve the projected decline in inflation from 34.6% to 15%. President Tinubu, however, remains optimistic. He did acknowledge the difficulties and sacrifices made by Nigerians and promised that they won't be in vain. He also highlighted government's reforms, which he believes are beginning to yield results. Nigeria's economy, he says, grew by 3.46% in the third quarter of 2024, up from 2.54% in the same period in 2023. Well, we're following updates with this document. It has now passed second reading at both houses. I think the Senate has adjourned to 14th of January. The big question is whether or not we can still keep the January to December budget cycle tradition that began a few years ago. Let's bring you some details in this report.
For the better part of the day's legislative business, members took turns to speak on the 2025 fiscal document laid by President Bola Tinubu on Wednesday. House leader says the ambitious spending plan will impact the lives of the people once passed into law.
What the budget has done is to isolate those critical areas that have far-reaching implications for other sectors of the economy.
Lawmakers commend the ingenuity of the executive in coming up with a spending plan of 49.7 trillion naira, but some raised concerns about implementation.
So debt management is critical to our national development and preservation of our international reputation.
Investment in the health sector is going to contribute to sustainable development growth in this country, and majority of Nigerian women and children will benefit from this.
The area of attention is said to be defense and security, infrastructure, education, and health. My question is, what about human capital development?
Other areas highlighted for priority attention include insecurity, fight against graft, food security, increased sectoral allocations, expansion of tax net, and environmental sustainability.
We should also look at how we are to increase the production sector and the local content of Nigerians.
We are hoping that the executive will not further request for loan to add more burden to the economy.
The executive, in their wisdom, to deploy technology in order to lead, if not permanently, in the board, our security challenges in our country.
President Tinubu's 2025 spending plan has now been referred to the Committee on Appropriation for further legislative action as the House goes on Christmas and New Year break to resume on the 14th of January 2025. The House has now extended the implementation of the capital components of the 2024 budget from 31st December to 30th June 2025, while work begins in earnest on the 2025 appropriation bill. Joke Yadsa, TVC News, Abuja.
The debate is on the 2025 spending plan. I'm joined on the program this morning by economist and CEO, Crowley Assets Management Limited, Johnson Chukwu. Mr. Chukwu, thank you for joining us. Compliments of the season to you.
Compliments of the season to you as well, and to all the viewers. Thank you for having me. Good morning.
Let us begin with an assessment of the economic progress in the outgoing year. I'm wondering how you evaluate Mr. President's claims of economic progress in 2024, considering the 3.46% GDP growth rate and the country's foreign reserves reaching nearly $42 billion.
Okay, if you look at the GDP figures and you consider the fact that the GDP moved from 3.19% to 3.46%, that could be assumed, or that could be described as an improvement, because you also saw, that means you saw a better GDP growth rate in the third quarter of this year. In terms of the Federal Reserve, the foreign exchange reserve, I think we have to take that one with some level of circumspect, because you all recognize that the creation we are seeing is not so much from improvement in crude oil sales. Yes, we've seen a positive balance of trade of about 5.8 trillion naira. But beyond that, the major creations we are having are coming from sale of short-term dated instruments, money market instruments by the central bank, which is incentivizing portfolio investors to bring in money for short-term purposes. If you look at the sales in the past two months of treasury bills, the government and the central bank has sold over 2.5 trillion naira in the past 2 months. And that clearly was mostly invested by foreign portfolio investors, a number of institutional investors. Then we've also seen some borrowing that are adding up to the foreign reserve. So I think it's not yet time for us to trouble our chest and say our foreign reserve is quite huge. We need to be focusing on what is the net foreign reserve. If you adjust the foreign reserve for short-term obligations that we have to pay back in a short while, then what do we really have? I don't think it's in that region of 40 billion. So having said that, I think in terms of, like I said earlier, in terms of economic progress, if you use the GDP figures to measure economic progress and you're moving from 3.19% to 3.46%, you will say that the economy is expanding. But if you go beyond that, you also look at other factors. You have to look at inflation rate. We are dealing with inflation rate of 34.6%. We are dealing with the food inflation about 39.93%. And those are the measures you have to look at. You are looking at the exchange rate in the region of 1,600, 1,650 in the past couple of months. And these are factors that impact on standard of living and cost of living of average citizens.
Absolutely, because that really is what Nigerians can see and feel, the price of commodity in the market. But what about the trade surplus of 5.8 trillion naira? Any significant impact on economic growth and development?
Yes, if you look at the trade surplus of 5.8 trillion, they could be described, they can be explained by these factors. One is that we are seeing a material decline in imports, which are also reflected in the GDP figure on trade. You saw a trade figure that grew at I think less than 1%. You also saw a manufacturing sector that grew at less than 1%. These are sectors that will determine how much of import we're having. The manufacturing sector will largely import raw materials. They will import some equipment. So, but if they are not growing, that means those imports are declining. If you look at the trade sector, we also saw a very weak trade sector in the Q3. So what I'm saying in effect is that remember that your imports are dollar induced, in the sense that the effect of dollar or the pass-through effect of naira depreciation will weaken imports. But your export is dollar denominated, so you're still exporting crude. And we saw an improvement in crude production in Q3. We saw a crude production that moved from 1.41 million barrels a day in Q2 to 1.47 million barrels a day in Q3 2024. So that improvement in export with a commensurate, with a counter, with a, what do you call it, a supporting decline in import is what led to the 5.8 trillion naira surplus, trade surplus. But bear in mind that that trade surplus is also reflected negatively in the standard of living of Nigerians, because it simply means more Nigerians can't afford the same quantity of goods and services they could afford earlier, and therefore they have reduced their consumption materially.
Absolutely. Government says it met 75% of its revenue target and 85% of its expenditure target in the outgoing year. What implications does this have for fiscal sustainability?
Well, the implication is that we are seeing an expansion in an increase in borrowing. If it makes 75% of its revenue and it made 85% of the expenditure, when you're already dealing with a higher projected deficit, simply means that that deficit has expanded because it's not able to meet the projected revenue. The revenue is short by 25%, whereas expenditure is only short by 15%. And that simply means your deficit is growing, and therefore government borrowing is growing. So we also need to look at the connectivity of when these figures are bandied around and see what other positive or what other negative are associated with this. And I think, for me, the focus should be we must meet, when you already have a budgeted deficit, you must do everything to meet your budgeted revenue. If you fail to meet your budgeted revenue, you are expanding your deficit. And deficit funding will either come in form of borrowing from government or borrowing from the private sector. If you borrow from the private sector, your interest payment obligation increases in subsequent years, which could explain why in the current 2025, the government is budgeting as much as 15 trillion naira as expenditure for debt service, compared to about 7.8 trillion, 11 point something trillion naira they budgeted in the outgoing year. And given the fact that we're budgeting about 36 trillion naira as total government revenue, at the same time you want to spend 15 trillion naira for debt service, it then means you're almost spending about 45% of total revenue on debt service. And that will constrain ability of government. So if you further have a situation where your revenues are running below your expenditure run rate, the problem is actually building up.
Interestingly, we have raised the revenue target to 34.82 trillion. That's like a 90% increase from what we had this year. How realistic is that target?
I can say without any fear of contradiction that those assumptions are quite ambitious. Let's start from the core revenues. You have the government had budgeted a 2.06 million barrels a day crude production. In the next year, crude production averaged 1.47 million barrels in Q3, 1.41 million barrels in Q2. So we are in the region of 1.4, 1.5 million barrels a day. There is no magic that will make us grow our crude oil production by over 500,000 barrels in a single year. That is, you're talking of daily crude production. Two, the government, and for that reason, if you look at the government has budgeted about 19.6 trillion naira as revenue from oil in 2025. As at August this year, total revenue from oil was just about 4 trillion naira. If you use that 4 trillion as a run rate, I said 8 months of the year, you did only 4 trillion. It simply means that at the end of this year, total revenue from oil will be about 6 trillion naira. How are you going to grow from 6 trillion naira in 2024 to 19 trillion naira in 2025? So clearly, the budget revenue is ambitious. And that's why we have to emphasize the fact that if we are running a budgeted revenue and the actual revenue is below the run rate for the expenditure, then you're going to be seeing expansion in your deficit. And that's the concern I have now, that the budget revenue is quite ambitious, look unrealistic, unachievable, and that, given that government is likely going to implement fully its expenditure budget, then we're going to see a material increase beyond the 13.4 trillion naira they have budgeted as deficit.
You know, some analysts are worried that this ambitious revenue projection might increase tax pressure on investors. What's your take on that?
I don't think that's the concern, because the government budget had made provision for tax revenue. If you look at that budget of 36 trillion in revenue, there is about 16 trillion 16.7 trillion budgeted for non-oil revenue. That amount of 16 trillion includes tax revenue. I don't think the government will, along the course of implementing the budget, further impose taxes on the citizens. So that's why I said, look, the deficit will be funded by other central banks, from central bank by ways and means, or from borrowing from the private sector. Either way, the economy, it has some cost or some material cost of the economy.
You talked about debt servicing earlier. We're allocating 15.81 trillion to that in the coming year. How do we balance this debt servicing with investments in critical sectors? Because they say it's not just about borrowing the money, it matters what we use the money for.
Yeah, that's why we need to emphasize that. My approach to it is this. The issue of funding critical capital infrastructure from budgetary allocation in the country is very weak, or the strength of the government to fund critical infrastructure from budgetary allocation is very weak. And the government has to review its approach to funding infrastructure. There is a lot of private capital out there waiting for the right environment, right incentive, right policy direction to fund infrastructure. If you cast a mind back, the telecommunications infrastructure in the country was 100% funded by government until the transformation that took place in, I think, 2000 or 2001, that handed over that sector to the private sector. Today, the telco sector is the second largest contributor to the GDP. Prior to that, it was an inconsequential segment of the GDP. So government government cannot continue to fund infrastructure for budget. We don't even have the money. If you look at, like I said, you are going to spend about 45% of the total revenue on debt service, and you are going to borrow another 13 trillion naira if the budget revenue is met. If it's not met, you may end up with about 14 or 15 trillion naira, which will add up further to your debt service. Bear in mind that debt service is what we call non-discretionary expense. The government does not have the latitude to say I won't pay debt. So what happens is that the debt service crowds out investment in critical social and fiscal infrastructure. Government in Nigeria, given the peculiarity of our physical environment, the capacity of the government to generate revenue, should focus on investing in social infrastructure that are not commercially viable, and then create the right environment, the right legal framework, the right commercial framework to bring in private sector into critical sectors of the economy. The railroads, there's no reason why we shouldn't have the private sector build standard gauges. There's no reason why we have the private sector build highways and have it tolled over a period of time.
Well, sounds like a lot of money into that sector, though. We're looking at the budget deficit that has increased by 42.5%. You talked about that earlier. I think that figure is 13.08 trillion. What really are the implications of this deficit for our fiscal space in the new year?
Yeah, that's why I said that it's likely going to be funded from the central bank, because I don't know if the federal government will want to come to the private sector to fund that amount. If it does, bear in mind that this year alone, the government has borrowed over 30 trillion naira from the economy. And that's why you are seeing that 15 trillion naira budget deficit. The government had borrowed about 13 trillion naira by ways of treasury bills, borrowed about 10 trillion naira by way of OMO, open market operation, and about 8 trillion naira or more from bonds. So these are factors that are leading to an uptick. And the funding and that 13 trillion naira, I think if you adjust for the exchange rate, it's no longer 13.8 trillion naira. The figure would, I think the figure I saw is effectively about 13.4 trillion naira. So if whatever is but above 13 trillion naira, funding it by central bank ways and means will inject it into the economy, further put pressure on price levels and put pressure on exchange rates. Two, if you fund it from private sector, you're going to crowd out private sector investors in the sense that government borrowing at a high cost will simply means you and I that want to borrow will also have to borrow at a high cost. So, and people will prefer to lend to the government before they lend to individuals because the government has lower risk. So you're going to crowd out private sector, and the risk sector of the economy, particularly the manufacturing sector, will suffer more in the year. So that's why I said either way you fund a huge deficit, it has some unintended negative impact on the economy.
Do you consider the viable alternatives to borrowing, especially, and do you think that we have reached that threshold yet, considering how much we've borrowed under this administration?
Well, it's difficult to say you have reached that threshold. It depends on what you consider as the threshold. A 15.7 or 15.8 trillion naira debt service against a revenue of 36 trillion naira is quite huge. Like I said, we're tending towards the 50%, and that's assuming that that revenue is achieved. The revenue achieved, you may end up crossing a 50% threshold. So we need to set a threshold of what we think this economy can afford in terms of debt service to revenue. The concept of referring to the GDP, debt service to GDP or national debt to GDP, for me, doesn't cut it, because that GDP is not generate as much revenue as some economies do, and therefore you cannot use debt service to GDP as a basis to compare Nigeria's debt sustainability. So it should be debt service to federal government revenue, and as we're approaching a 50% threshold, assuming budgeted revenue is even met, that should set the alarm. By now, we should have the alarm ringing in our ears, and then we should be applying the brake. And like I already made mention of, what are the alternatives to federal government funding infrastructure from budgetary allocation? We really don't have that space in the budget for massive infrastructure funding like we're doing today. Every amount we're going to put on infrastructure is borrowed. So if it has to be borrowed, why don't we farm it out to the private sector that have records of more efficiency in deployment of economic resources, and let them borrow even globally or internationally and fund those infrastructure and get their money over a period of time.
Absolutely. There are some very interesting projections in this spending plan. Let's look at inflation and exchange rates. The budget assumes a decline in inflation from 34.6% to 15%, and an improvement in exchange rate from 1,700 naira per dollar to 1,500. Are you optimistic that these are realistic?
You know, some of the last comments I made is that if the government borrows the money from the central bank, liquidity will be injected into the economy. That liquidity will pursue few goods because manufacturing sector is weak, it's not producing. The trade sector is weak, it's not importing. So if that pursues more
outgoing year, quite optimistic and ambitious to anticipate that inflation will decline from 34.6% to 15% in the new year, and also we are basing the exchange rate at 1,500 naira.
I had mentioned that the government's intention to fund 13 trillion naira will have a direct impact on the inflation rate and exchange rate. If the government is going to fund it from the central bank, it will inject liquidity into the economy, and that liquidity will not be backed by productive activities, which will further put pressure on inflation and put pressure on exchange rate. If the government borrows from the private sector to fund it, it will crowd out the private sector in terms of ability to fund infrastructure, and that liquidity injection will also have unintended negative consequences on the exchange rate. I had also said that the surest way to fight inflation today in the country is to improve food production, because the major pressure point is coming from food inflation. And I know the government had planned in the 2025 budget to invest so much on security to push back on those.
Mr. Chukwu, let's take Mr. George's call from Ikeja. Good morning, Mr. George.
Good morning, Nifemi, and good morning to Mr. Chukwu. Nifemi, thank you for staying on the subject this morning. I have two questions to ask. The first one is to you as a media practitioner, and the second one is to Mr. Chukwu as a finance expert. Why is it, the first one to you, sir, why is it that you do not normally talk about budgeting and budget performance unless only at a period that the government has presented budget to the National Assembly. You ought to be briefing the people at the fourth estate of the realm about what the government is claiming, what the performance is, and what your investigative reports are saying. For example, the government has claimed now that there is 85% performance in the 2024 budget. How true is that? We have finance experts in media practice. These are things we expect them to be doing and brief the people about the truth or otherwise of government claims. Please help us for that. That is one. The second one is to Mr. Chukwu. Government says from 34% inflation, they plan within a year to drop it to 15%. How do you marry this with the cost of food items in the market that is skyrocketing by the day? A bag of rice that I bought recently is over 100,000, a bag of rice. The government promised that they were going to establish commodity boards to buy commodities from farmers and thereby do some kind of price control and sell to the public at a determined price, ensuring that profit to the farmers is not lost in the process. How, if that has not been done, how is inflation going to dramatically come down to 15%? As an ordinary person, I'm just wondering how it's going to happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. George. Mr. Chukwu, I think mine was a charge, but yours is a question. You want to answer it, right?
No, I hardly heard him because there was a lot of background noise.
He was talking about the anticipated decline in inflation rate, as ambitious as Mr. President put it, from 34 to 15%, and was asking what that means for an average Nigerian that he just got a bag of rice for over 100,000 naira. Practically, how is that expected to play out in the coming year?
Well, I think for an average Nigerian, we already said that that figure looks ambitious. And we also have to bear something in mind because it's obviously an illusion that people have when they say inflation rate is going to drop. Even if the inflation rate drops to 15%, it then means that the price you are buying today at 100,000 naira, you are going to buy it at 115,000 naira. It does not mean that the rice you are buying at 100,000 naira will go to 85,000 naira. So what the president is saying that the rate at which price levels will increase further next year is 15%. We all agree that's very ambitious. That looks quite optimistic. So, but assuming that is achieved, it simply means you, George, and I, Johnson, Chukwu, and every other person should now budget that whatever we are buying at 100 naira today, we're going to buy it next year 115 naira average, on the average. So it then means you must grow your income by a minimum of 15% to even maintain your current standard of living. So if you think the pains are now high on you, or the pressure points are quite intense on you, you need to know that it will intensify by 15% if you do not grow your income by another 15%. So people need to understand that. But we're even saying that given the variables in the economy in terms of food production, which is a major pressure point, in terms of exchange rate pass-through, in terms of energy costs. Of course, energy costs may drop next year because we expect crude prices will drop below the government projected $25 per barrel. And if that happens, that simply means that even the government ability to generate revenue will be further constrained. So if you see probably a drop in fuel price next year, whether that drop in energy input cost will materially bring down inflation rate to 15%, it's difficult for anybody to say. But bear in mind that even if you have a 15% increase in inflation on average, that your total average cost of living will increase by 15% from what it is today, and need to be put in context. That Nigerians need to understand that. It's interesting the way you have put it. That means even at 15%, rice will still go as high as 115,000. You know what they say in the local parlance, that what goes up doesn't come down.
Are you saying is it a global phenomenon? There's no dynamics that will make Nigerians be able to buy products and commodities at the price they used to buy it before, let's say 2023?
It's not a common thing. It has happened in places like Japan, but it's not even a good economic. It's not a good economic situation where you're having deflation, where prices are dropping. It only happens where you have severe economic dislocation, like economic crash, economic depression. That's very rare. What happens, or what we should pray for, is that price levels never really go back to their original figures. Otherwise, if you cast your mind back, when I got admission in University of Lagos, how much did I pay? Every amount I paid, including accommodation, everything, was 108 naira, including 90 naira as base pay for 1 year. Do you expect price to go back to that, and then you have to pay 108 naira?
You know, that's for many Nigerians, that's what it means, that somebody will come and make a naira a dollar again. But just hold that thought for a minute. Rev Dominic has called in from Alimosho. Good morning, Reverend. Reverend, turn down the volume of your TV set so we can hear you clearly.
Good morning, Femi. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now. Please go ahead.
Can you hear me? Do I go on?
Good morning.
Yes, yes.
Okay, I don't know if your guest can hear me. Honestly, when I hear, I hope your guest can hear me. Yeah, when I hear that this budget is ambitious, it gives me a lot of worry. Does it mean a nation like Nigeria cannot have a realistic budget? When they say it's ambition, you know what ambition is? Ambition is a dream you may not achieve or you may achieve. So how do we run a budget in a very sensitive nation like Nigeria with a high inflation, with population growing and the kind of hunger we have here, and we cannot have a realistic budget? It is scary. And what people are trying to say that things may go down, it's not possible. If you guys hear me, the last budget was predicated on 780 naira per dollar, if I'm very right. Now, this budget is on 1,500 naira per dollar. To me, if we, as an illiterate economist, it may get worse next year. If you are buying rice at 100,000 naira now, where the budget is sitting on 780, and we're buying 100,000, many is officially 1,500. With Nigeria factor, it means dollar, it may get 1,800, 900, 2,000 next year. How will things go down? I don't understand how we run the economy. But what I'm trying to say is that this thing we are mounting, ambitious budget, it doesn't give anybody hope. If we know English ambition, it means all the
Reverend Dominic, but you are the one who teaches us on Sundays that faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Are you saying we should not exercise faith in our budget planning as a nation?
Yes, but Femi, when you are running a nation, it's not a faith-based, it's not a religious thing. A nation is a nation run on physical policies. It don't run it on faith. Faith is something you don't see. It's not realizable. You trust God, He will do it. But we're running an economy that we must have 1 + 1, which is 2. It's not a faith thing. It's a practical thing. Of course, faith does that also work. Practical faith is nothing. So what I'm trying to say, why is it a nation, Nigeria, in this day and age, cannot have a realistic budget, but a dream or ambitious budget?
I think your point is made clearly, Reverend. Indeed. Thank you so much for calling in. Mr. Chukwu, what do you think? Is there a balance between faith and works where the budget is concerned?
Well, I won't even take it from faith and work. I will take it from the same Rev Dominic's religious background, where the devil tempted Christ and asked Christ that if you are the Son of God, jump from this cliff, and then God will exchange a charge over you, and they will bear you up in their wings. And Christ told him, do not tempt the Lord your God. You see, faith does not amount to taking irrational. It doesn't amount to taking irrational decisions or illogical decisions. There is some we draw budget, we say that the budget must be achievable. It must be a stretch budget. If they tell you a good budget has this attribute, it must be a stretch budget in the sense that it will make you go beyond your normal competencies to do to achieve what you think is extraordinary. But then it also says it must be achievable, which means a diligent person throwing the best he has will achieve it. But if you make a budget unachievable, it becomes disincentivizing for people to really work towards achieving it. Like what we said, what are you going to do that will grow crude production from an average of 1.4 million barrels a day in 2024 to 2.06 million barrels a day in 2025? Remember, they had budgeted about 1.78 million barrels this year. That was your budget for this year, 1.78 million barrels. You have achieved about 1.4 million barrels. You now want to come up with a 2.06 million barrels a day. You know the macroeconomic environment has changed a lot. Donald Trump will be sworn in again as the president of U.S. You know the man does not believe in carbon emission, in ozone layer depletion. Indeed. So he doesn't believe in alternative energy sources. And he's going to push to make sure that America's crude production increases further. Today, America is already the biggest crude producer. So if that happens, we are going to see crude prices drop. And it's likely going to disrupt the OPEC Plus that has sustained crude prices at official levels. So these are factors you know that will bring down crude prices. You're budgeting $75 per barrel. You know that's not achievable. You can't change it. You can't influence the price of it. So if you consider those factors, and for that reason, you are budgeting about 19.6 trillion naira as revenue from crude, when in the end of second quarter of this year, end of first 8 months of this year, you only had about 4 trillion naira. So which means at that run rate, you will have about 6 trillion naira. How are you going to achieve 19 trillion? So those are factors that you will not say is beyond faith. It's the issue that how rational, how reasonable are those things.
So even the crude oil price benchmark has to battle with potential fluctuations in the global market, like you mentioned. We also heard the Senate President talking about an extension of the 2024 budget by 6 months. It means it will run till about June. But lawmakers, I think, have now gone on break till January. This document has passed second reading at both houses. What are the chances of meeting the January to December budget cycle tradition? Is that still feasible given our current situation?
Well, if they've gone on Christmas recess and they've not, though I understand the budget has gone to first and second reading, and they have not done the detailed work on the budget, which are the committee levels, then
I think that the committee is expected to keep working during the holiday, though. I think that's how it works.
Okay, but if they keep working during the holidays, that means the Senate President and the Speaker of the House of Representatives will reconvene the National Assembly before 31st of December, and they will approve the budget. But don't put it beyond them. They've done that before. I think that's what they did last year. They just came back and said the budget is approved. And I think it's still possible. But the key thing is the rigor that we need to subject the budget to, whether we are subjecting it to, or whether we're just carrying out the perfunctory role of approving the budget, just whatever comes to the National Assembly is approved. I don't think they have enough time to do a thorough job on the budget review and any necessary adjustment. But whether they can approve the budget before December, I think they can. They have a record of doing that, and don't rely on the fact that they're going to reconvene maybe on 29th or 30th of December and stamp the budget and say it's been approved.
The budget cycle, is it about when it was assented to as law, or when the implementation actually commences?
Well, implementation cannot commence until it is signed into law. That's when it becomes an existing policy, it becomes an implementable budget. So it's only when it's signed into law that happens. But ordinarily, if we have to maintain fiscal prudence, when a new budget is signed into law, the old budget should cease to exist or operate. The concept of extending budgets by 6 months, for me, it amounts to double counting. and then you have multiple expenditures being put into the economy. So it's difficult at that point to measure effectively the impact of any fiscal year's budget and the level of liquidity injected into the economy.
Mr. President did say that this budget is possible with disciplined implementation and transparency. From what you've covered over the years, precisely how do you think government can ensure disciplined implementation, transparency, and collaboration with stakeholders to achieve the objectives of a budget?
Well, normally the budget will have a detailed breakdown. And that detailed breakdown is at the granular level. When I say granular level, each ministry, agency, and department will have its budget. If you want to buy a pen, it will be there. So the key thing is what level of monitoring does the budget office have? We know a private sector business entity that called Budget IT, which has shown some level of competence in monitoring government expenditure. I don't think that level of thoroughness or detailed monitoring of budget implementation is there at the Ministry of Budget and National Planning. But beyond that, there is also the critical role the National Assembly is supposed to play, which is in terms of oversight of the budget as part of the integral part of their functions. If they are carrying out proper oversight of the budget, they should ordinarily ask the ministers to present their budget performance on a quarterly basis, and then they will go to the granular level of checking the items that are contained in the budget and how they've been implemented. And then there should be, I think there is a ministry whose job is to review effective, I think due diligence or so agency. The job is supposed to make sure that whatever is implemented, value for money is obtained in the course of procurement, and that actual work is done. If we have those things and we carry them to the letters, then we should have effective implementation of the budget. Absolutely.
There are also some very interesting assumptions here. There are about 3 key factors that Mr. President talked about: expectation of reduced fuel importation and increased export of refined petroleum products, which we saw this year with the Dangote refinery and the Port Harcourt refinery. He's also talked about improved security. How much impact do you see these have on the performance of this budget in the new year?
Well, in terms of a reduction in price of refined petroleum products, of course, there is no budget. There's no provision in the budget for subsidy. I don't see how much that will flush into the government revenue. What you may rather see is that it will relieve average consumers of pressures in terms of price of fuel, and therefore free up resources for consumption of other goods and services. And if that happens, then that means average household consumption will improve, demand will improve, and if demand improves, it should incentivize the manufacturing sector to produce more. So we may see a stronger growth in the GDP, but I don't think we'll achieve the 4.6%.
Mr. Chukwu, please hold that thought for a minute. Okurafo, Mr. has been calling from Chukwu. I understand he's been online for a while. Mazi, please, you have the floor. Go ahead quickly.
There are 2 things I want us to look at. The budget, I want you to have that issue of that space of all the MDS, all the ministers, if you look at the causes of any problem in any unit, not looking at the symptoms. What we normally see in Nigeria is that the ministry go there to look at the symptoms, so they go together. Now look at, let me see, for example, what are the causes of crisis in Nigeria? Unemployment, name them. That is why you see this Boko Haram, because when they come, they recruit this boss and that. The critical aspect of it is COVID, essentially, both kinetic and non-kinetic. It will help. A situation whereby agencies keep the money. At the end of the year, they will share it among themselves, among the hierarchy there. Not being the need for. I think we are clearly what happened about the road construction in Nigeria. When some people will come, they collect the initial, when they collect half of the
do 1/4 of the job, they will disappear with the money because it that it's no record. Which is not ready. I start asking myself, all these people that are executing this thing are disappearing with them. Where are they going with this money? Are they going to wait close between their entrances? It's not possible. No, honestly, there's not the federal government to say about it. All the agencies in Nigeria, there must be an organization that will be monitoring what they are doing. They are from Monday to Friday, from January to December. That is the only way our budget will have a human face that we can tackle the causes. But as long as Nigeria continues tackling the symptoms of issues in organizations, they are not going to achieve it. Good morning, Mazi from Chukwu in Niger State.
Thank you, Mazi. I agree with you that it's important that we monitor, the progress of budget implementation on a monthly basis. Mr. Chukwu, we're running out of time now. Quickly, I just wanted to touch on how you see these allocations driving economic growth in the new year. We now know that defense and security, just like in the previous year, has taken the lion's share, 4.91 trillion, followed by infrastructure, and followed by education and health.
Well, the order of priorities are reflective of the challenges we have in the economy. Defense is one of the most critical sectors we need to address. Apart from the kinetic use of kinetic forces to fight insecurity, we also need to look at how to win the hearts of those people in those areas and also convert back those who have gone astray, like we say in religious palace. But then you talk of infrastructure. I have spoken extensively on infrastructure, and I believe we should take out infrastructure largely and then hand it over to the private sector to free up resources for government. Education are areas, health are areas I think we should focus on. Like I said in some of my earlier comments, that government should focus its expenditure on non-physical infrastructure, on social infrastructure, education and health. Those are very critical if we have to build the quality of human capital that will catalyze this economy into a first world economy in terms of skill sets, in terms of health of the citizens. While as we can bring in private sector to do that, which they can do more effectively and at cheaper cost. If security is basically almost exclusive preserve of the government, we need to do a lot to restore security in the country, and which will help us improve food production. I had emphasized extensively on food production, and insecurity is impeding food production and crude production. Those are two critical factors that have brought us to our knees. If we improve crude production and improve food production, we will see the economy recover at a faster rate.
Interesting. We are looking forward to a brand new year. Nigerians are full of hope. This administration is running on renewed hope. Mr. President himself acknowledges an ambitious spending plan, but he believes that it can happen. Thank you so much for your contribution on the program this morning. I've been speaking with economist and CEO, Crowley Assets Management Limited, Mr. Johnson Chukwu. Compliments of the season to you again, and Happy New Year in advance.
Same wishes to you and all our viewers.